How is it you could understand lunar possession, but why last week's show was so good seems to evade you? That part's still strange to me.
Because I think it's because I don't know if there was anything new besides the story about casting the demons out. I don't know if there was anything that I hadn't said in other episodes. Maybe there was. Maybe that's what. That's you know what I mean. I think I had said all that stuff before. I thought I had.
Not all of it.
Not all of it. I guess there were a couple things you got me to admit to.
Well, one of the things you didn't walk through very clearly was how possession comes from from the moon, or
How
how
the
it troubles it someone. That part you didn't like. I listened back to it again, and you had to give so much foundation. You were like you're catching me up on how everything works, just so you can get to that. And we never got to. Oh yeah, this is
and
how. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I may have avoided that. So what are we talking about today? That's
We got
yeah.
time.
We still got time. You
I'm
think
caught
you,
up now.
you think people are wondering?
I'm wondering if I don't care about anybody else. Really, be honest with you, I'm wondering like, so what? So I understand. So okay, there's two things. Someone hit us up on Twitter, I believe, and was like, "Hey, Jason had talked about the fact that we had Mars problems before, and with the pig and the whole
Yeah.
situation with Mars." And I remember that when you were told me the second time, I was like, "Oh yeah, we did talk about that." I didn't have a category for it yet.
Right.
Um, and so I still have to figure out what is it that happens to make someone feels like Mars is bothering them. I don't understand that yet, nor do I understand what somebody has to be going through that the moon plagues them, right? In this, you even talked about police, full moon, they know things are going to be crazy. Well, what's happening there that somehow I mean, you talked a little bit about it in the sense that the the way that the moon operates and affects our waters here and the tide and so on and so forth, and us being made up of so much water, it might actually have some sort of effect on us too and how we interact. That was something that you set forth. Um, but I still don't understand how the possession part of that happens.
Yeah. Well, I think so. We have a strict physical spiritual divide that we just assume that we take with us everywhere, and we don't actually and as Christians we might even say, well, no, we know that's not real, but all of our metaphor systems that we think in, all the language that we think in, actually that assumption is embedded. That's one of the things that makes it so difficult, because we don't, even our word influence has come to mean physical influence. So like influenza, which is our word, which is now a specific virus
Mhm,
that affects
mhm.
us, that actually used to be a general disease that meant that there was an influence of there was some sort of broken influence between us and the cosmos, right? That the so in the word influence now, because we are materialists by assumption, even if not by theology, right? We're materialists by assumption. We think influence has to do with something that the five senses can touch, right? There has to be some sort of physical force that for there to be an influence. And we've dropped our language. I mean, we only believe, for example, that there are five senses, right?
Right.
There's just five, right? But in the
Oh,
Middle Ages, they believed in 10.
what?
Right? There were 10 senses, because um, there were the five that interacted with the physical realm, and then the five senses of the mind, which we'll see if I can come up with them: memory, fantasy, imagination, um, uh, there's two more. I can't think of them off the top of my head. Um, because you wouldn't tell me what we were talking about, so I'm unprepared.
You're always unprepared. There's nothing new here.
No, that's true. Live my life unprepared. But so they believed in five senses, and those ones were the influence of those senses upon us, and those senses and that upon the world didn't function through physical matter, right? So the way the things that were in your imagination had an effect upon your life, and the things that influenced your imagination weren't necessarily just simple physical things. Reason is one of the other senses. And so, and we have even we have even all of those things, the ones that we can turn into a physical property like memory. We conflate into our brain memory and say, well, memory is the wrinkles in your brain and those sorts of things. Now there is some connection between our brain and our memory, but there's also, I mean, one of the realities that we know now because of the microscope and how much more we have studied the human body is that the brain isn't only in our skull. Right? The brain actually extends throughout our body. The second largest piece of brain is in our stomach, is in our gut, right? So you've got our brain is not only in our head, it's actually extended all throughout, which is why you get gut feelings with memory. There's a whole, our body is an interconnected unit, right? It's a biologically interconnected unit but it's not simple biology, right? Our body is mind, body, spirit. In my understanding, the word soul is actually the all of it together, right? So, our spirit and our body God created our body in Adam, blew the spirit into our nose, we came alive, and we were a living soul, right? Our body and mind together, our body and spirit together, and the Greeks also pull the mind and the spirit apart, and they delegate different aspects of the mind into their own categories so that you can talk more accurately about them. Greek and Latin are both more accurate. They're languages with where the words attach to smaller portions of things. They divide things up further. But when Jesus, so you've got in Hebrew, you've got love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, and strength, with your heart, soul, and strength. But the Greeks actually divided the heart up into mind and heart, and when Jesus repeats things, he actually is fine with the added distinction with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, which is a distinction that the Greeks added. So there's not a problem with distinguishing further, but what we have done is in distinguishing further, we've separated, right, things that are actually a single unit looked at from different angles. And so because of that view of mankind that we have, that we are a physical creature, that we're a physical thing, primarily, we have dropped all of the senses that have to do with non-physicality, all the internal or spiritual mind senses, because we don't believe that influence comes any other way except through physical, right? So if something's going to affect us, it has to come at us in a way that touches us through physics, biology, physics, something like that. And our understanding of physics then is that it is a blind physical process, right? That there's not, so why does a stone fall? Well, a stone falls because the blind force of gravity pulls it or pushes it down, depending on which physicist you're talking to. Is it a pull or is it a push, or what, how does it work? But they push on one another through the force of gravity. Well, what is gravity? Gravity is the force that pushes and pulls physical bodies together, right? We've named something that is still actually a mystery. Well, in the ancient world, when you look at Aristotle, he says, why does a rock fall? Well, because its natural place is with the other rocks, right? The world is a rock. It's a giant rock. And so we know that its natural place is with the rocks. And so it's returning to its natural place, right? So it falls because of its internal nature, according to Aristotle. But as the Middle Ages went on, they added actually a whole layer of metaphors that they're pulling from the scriptures to think about it. Why that actually all of creation has a desire to do what God wants it to do. All right. So it's not even just simple, like, well, it's got its nature. It actually, in their metaphor system, now whether or not they actually believed that the rocks and the stones and the trees had real desires, in their metaphor system, it was they derived their nature from what God said they were, who God says they were. And so when they fall, they're doing it to glorify God, right? They're desiring to be who God made them to be. And so, rocks fall, birds fly, trees wave in the wind blows, and all the way up to, that's why the stars move and the planets do what they do, right? Is that there is there's two sort of metaphors they use. There's the liturgical dance of creation,
Yeah.
right? It's worshiping, and so it moves the way that it's moving through the liturgy that God established in its daily offices, right? The daily worship services, its weekly or its monthly worship services, and its yearly worship services. Because the week is not a part of the astronomical calendar, right? The week is something that we count out. It's something that, so there's not an astronomical week, right? There are lunar months counted by the moon. There are solar months that have to do with the number of the where the movement between one sunset and the next sunset, one sunrise and the next sunrise, and the different directions that the sunrises and sunsets move. There are lunar months that have to do with the full moon to new moon. There are daily astronomical events: sunrise, sunset. The stars move through a pattern every year. The other aspects of the other part of a solar month has to do with which constellations the sun is rising in and setting in, and so those are all astronomical. The week is something that is not an astronomical. It's because of God's creation order. It took God 6 days and then he rested on the seventh, right? So it is something that is not embedded in the movements of creation in the same sort of way, right? So the sun, the moon, the stars are a calendar, and they move through their calendar in a liturgical dance, and they go through, they fulfill their offices, which is a word that had to do with worship services in the Middle Ages as well as other things. So you've got that understanding of the whole world being interconnected because God created it in rhythms and patterns, right? And then the other metaphor system that they used a lot is music, right? So the music of the spheres is something that you find in the ancient world, but really it comes to its peak in Boethius de Musica, and the music of the spheres he says that creation is one giant symphony singing together, um, and worshiping together, creating music together, and so that it all actually fits. And so, um, when sin moved us out from under the positive influence of creation because of its poetic unity, its poetic the it is created to reflect and show and put forth God's nature, who God is, what he's like, and to return worship to him. So all of creation is in this perpetual worship. Sin kicked us out of our place, our intended place in the symphony.
Mm.
And so when our actions are discordant, right, we no longer fit well. Now God wrote the kind of song that it navigates through everything, and then our discordant stuff ends up becoming, in the broader scheme of things, ends up becoming a part of the harmony, right? That's God's genius in the way that he wrote the symphony. But that's not but that was us trying to act against him, but him being wiser than us, right? We jump out of the symphony, we play different parts than we're supposed to, and then his in his manifest and manifold wisdom, all of those parts end up finding a harmony within the broader story, and the discordant it ends up finding a place where it all comes back together. So you've got this really interesting metaphor system where the world's influence is on us, but it's on us like music, right? The heavens are the influence of the heavens is on us like music, and that the way music influences us. Boethius says that the heavens, when we look at them properly, they tune us into our place in the symphony when we see them by faith, right? We are tuned. We are instruments that are out of tune because of sin, but the heavens, the influence of the heavens upon us, when we see them properly and we look up, we are tuned into the symphony, right? So we don't have, and so we immediately start saying like, well, how does that influence work? Well, that's because, and what we mean is it a physical, like, is it the light that does it? Like vitamin D, like we get enough vitamin D from the sun, and so we're happier. And there is something to that. There is a physical aspect to it, but there's actually a cosmological influence that they were comfortable talking about that we are not, because our metaphor system doesn't allow it. So the something that would be really interesting to think through is like the physical manifestations of a teenager falling for a girl for the first time are really similar to seasickness. Right? Like they're really similar. Like you feel sick to your stomach and you kind of want to throw up, and but one of them is something that we love and we hunt for and we try, and like we want that to happen, and the other one, nobody loves seasickness. But when you get the description, it's very similar. How is it that why is it that suddenly a woman has that effect on a boy, on a teenager? Well, we immediately say hormones. When you read up on the evolutionary biologists, it's all like, well, the shape of cleavage does this thing, makes the lizard brain think of that I can extend my progeny there, because it has the same shape as a monkey's rear end when it lifts its tail. Like you're like, and there are people that take that seriously, right? There's people that read that and they're like, yeah, that makes sense. Like it absolutely does not make any
Not in
sense,
any way.
not in any way. But yet but when you only believe in the physical influence, you've got to come up with that sort of explanation, right? You've got to have that
Okay.
that there's some sort of, that there's a lizard brain in the back of our head, that remembers what it's like to be a reptile, and so back there, that's exerting a particular influence on the upper cortex, or frontal lobe, or where our higher faculties are. Um,
Instead of what's actually going on, which is
what's actually going on is the whispers of Eden
mm,
are hitting your eyes, right? The
mm,
that you the because it's not that there isn't a memory, right? It's just not a memory of being. It's not that there isn't a corporate memory within us. It's just not a memory of being a lizard, right? I was up at Lake Coeur d'Alene, and man, um, I love the lake. I love the beach. I love the ocean. And I got there early in the day and set up my tent, and where the everybody was going to come and have lunch later. And so I was holding down the fort, and there's almost no one there. But throughout the day, more and more people start showing up. And I love the smell of suntan lotion, and and I was
I do.
downwind from it, right? And so everybody comes and they're putting on their sunscreen, and I'm like, this is the best. This is great. And but one of the things that I love is all these teenagers who want it to be like Eden again.
Yeah.
Now, often they're doing it poorly because they're not doing it under the oversight of loving parents, and they don't have the wisdom. But they're out there, playing volleyball and throwing each other in the water, and and it's like they want Eden so bad, right? And that's the reality. And as the church, we should be wanting Eden for them even more than they do. Instead, what we do is we say, don't go to the beach. There's too much temptation there. Flee, flee. There's no good use for your bodies. They're just trying to trick you and destroy you. And the whole world hates you. So you should probably hide. Maybe a burqa would be good. Um, now we know that not to say that out loud, but we also do have a tendency to think more like Muslims about something like this.
Okay.
Um,
So this is where I want to go to. It's not where I want to go to. I just want to dig a little deeper in this. So one side gets rid of the cosmological influence, the unseen realms influence, by making it imperialistic, right? If you can't see it, taste it, touch it, it doesn't exist because you need to be able to examine it scientifically,
right?
right?
Yeah.
So
The empirical is the only thing that's real.
right,
The only
and
influence that's real.
so then what is the church's response to that? What is their, so that's a secular response. Is the church actually fitting right inside that same category?
Yeah, we tend to to come right along, and often what we do is we defend what they said 30 years ago and call it conservatism, traditionalism. And it's really just last generation's secularism. um, but instead of actually seeing, letting the scriptures inform our understanding of reality, right? That our understanding of reality is that so we'll defend that it was created by God, but we'll defend it using science, right? Or science, but science the way they do things, right? You can't actually study history with science, right? History, the scientific method doesn't work for the study of history. It's a method that is a forward facing method. The scientific method is. But the scientific method is the only way we believe you can get to truth, because we believe in empirical data being the only thing that is trustworthy.
Right.
Um, Rather than, so even when we defend that the world is created by God, we tend to do it with the scientific method, rather than with, well, we've got many other possible methods, right? We've got the historical method, we've got historical records, right? That and that gets us real truth, real knowledge. We've also got what I think of as the poetic method, right?
Mm.
The argument from beauty, right? That because really, and I think I texted you about this. I was thinking about this
I was trying
week.
to ask you about, yeah, because okay, yeah, let's. What I don't even know. Like when you texted me, I was like, "What is he talking? What is?" Like, you always your
I'm
head
just
is.
I'm trying to throw my thoughts together, and
I love that.
you're my muse.
Don't stop. Oh, is this the big book of being rude? 7,000 slang insults. That's not it.
Yeah, my wife brought me that.
And it's kind of like yeah. I'm not going to describe it, but I think I want this book. Get for my wife and for the kids. That's
It's so funny.
awesome.
So it's like
Um,
if you're going to insult each other, at least do it intelligently. Here's 7,000 historical insults. It's so
read
funny.
So is this the okay? I think evangelism is the most is mostly an exercise introducing people to reality for the first time. Oh yeah, go ahead and read that. Do you have that?
Yeah.
Do you want to
So,
this?
well, so I was thinking about how we do evangelism and how so often well, I guess I can just read it. Maybe that'll work.
Or is it the Christopher Dawson quote?
Well, so the Christopher Dawson quote, I was just reading that, but it's a lot of the things that we've talked about. So he says, first and above all, it's necessary for Western man to recover the use of his higher spiritual faculties, his powers of contemplation, right? And so, that's those other senses beyond just physical,
Hmm.
which have become atrophied by centuries of neglect, during which the mind and will of Western man was concentrated on the conquest of power,
Hmm.
political, economic, and technological. Um, so and that's the opening page of a new book that I just picked up on leisure. I won't tell you about it because you.
I'll go
I'm
buy it. What's
yeah.
I want the title now.
The title. I picked up a couple of new books. I'm really excited about.
Oh man, your camera is following you.
Oh, serious?
Yeah, it just followed you all the way over there.
This is Roman. This is my intern.
Hi, intern.
Hello.
Welcome to Knox Unplugged. You're gonna get really bored.
So we got Beauty for Truth's Sake on the Re-Enchantment of Education. So I picked up two books on Re-Enchantment. Okay. So that's one of them. But just think, because this has been on my mind, and I've been thinking about how we do evangelism. Because we also believe in a disenchanted world, right? We actually haven't re-met reality ourselves. And so we don't realize that really the first part of evangelism is actually introducing people or reintroducing people to reality for the first time, right? We don't realize, and so all of our apologetics ends up being defensive.
Yeah.
But it's because we don't even know what an offensive apologetic would look like, because an offensive apologetic is actually pointing out the beauty of God. Right? So Augustine defines conversion as the Spirit's work to change the Spirit's work to change our perception of Christ from ugly to beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So he says, what's the difference? Well, when the Spirit works in you, you look at Jesus and you see how beautiful he is, or you see how. So you want it, right? It's a change of desires, but it's a change of what you fundamentally believe to be beautiful, right? And so we don't have an offensive apologetic because we don't believe in a beautiful, enchanted creation, a beautiful, enchanted history, a beautiful and enchanted vision of God and his current present interactions with us by the power of the Spirit. in his and in his sovereignty. Right. So beauty, we actually don't even know how to define beauty, because we'll say, well, beauty, it's kind of, in the eye of the beholder, or beauty is subjective, right? So we have already agreed with them on the nature of reality at that point, that we actually add something with our mind. We add the organizing principle, right? That is modernism, right?
Mm.
That if beauty is not objective, we're moderns, or postmoderns, or postmoderns, right? That's the newest thing,
So
right?
I think being saturated in an environment like that, are you saying, oh man, there's so many, I got a bunch of questions here. I haven't even gotten to I got a bunch of, because here's, if I had to put, after listening to last week, if I had to put a title or some sort of guarding premise for this conversation, it is breaking curses and re-enchanting. That's
Yeah,
that's kind of where I want to get to, because I think last week we dealt with the fact that there's another type of witchcraft enchantment going on, and we're broken. And so, and here's something else. So I was reading through, because of the climate change stuff that's happening, and it's about to be a really big deal, and the heat waves, and the big push for the new green stuff, and climate. One of the things I started going back and looking at was, why do we have environmental issues and environmental problems? Well, the more that I've been talking with you and understand cosmology, if we really do have an environmental problem, it's because we are cursed.
right,
Right. We like that's people don't believe in curses anymore, but would be exactly what a curse would look like. You don't get water on your land, your animals die, you have sexual deviance everywhere. There's crime and turmoil in your streets. You were talking about school shootings. Why do we have schools? We are cursed. Do you
right,
understand that? Like, that is not some weird thing that's happened out in the past with witches and stuff. No, this is what happens when you reject God. When you reject God and you choose not to honor him as God, and you live like the world has, you get cursed. And so you don't get water on the land. Like, you don't get the things that you need to have a climate that is happy to sing in harmony with everything else in the world, because you're out of harmony in a lot of ways towards God. And so there is this massive need to break the curse and re-enchant the world, right?
yes,
And so part of you were just talking about evangelism. I can see how we do evangelism wrong, because it's so hard. I want to connect these two things, Jason. I want to connect the saving of souls and the living in the world and the harmony of that. Because when people go out and preach the gospel, they have one goal, and it's an essential goal. If someone's eternity is going to depend on whether or not they enjoy the beauty of beauty of Christ and the reality of the world, if that is a reality that they're going to face one day, that should be of most importance to them, right?
right,
Like, should be of most importance. And I think there's a lot of people who preach and talk about the gospel so that that reality, that they never hear depart from me, or never thrown away, that reality, they come into the reality of knowing Christ, loving Christ, and experiencing the beauty of Christ and his universe for eternity, right?
right.
So that's of most importance. But somehow in there, that middle part, the enchantment of this world and how that operates, is all flipped, where we don't even care about this world so much, as long as we don't break laws, right? We live nice, peaceable, quiet lives, right? And so this middle world is kind of ignored in our evangelism. How do you, when evangelizing to someone, what is the process of re-enchanting that and bringing the soul to Christ? Like, it seems like those are two separate things, right?
Well, but that's the reason it seems like two separate things, is because we don't believe in an integrated universe in which God actually has a spot for us here. Right?
Okay,
We
but
don't.
so let me push back on that just a little bit. For a lot of people who are inside of the more reform world, they are thinking, that wait, Paul talked about, I came to you with nothing else but the gospel that was given to me, that Christ, he was died and he was buried and he was raised back from the dead. And that's the message of the gospel, that if people believe that and trust in that message, they should be made new and live and be saved and be Christians and live holy lives after that.
Right.
That's
And
that's the gospel.
that is the gospel, but the gospel is the good news. That's good news because it is the breaking of the curse on creation and the beginning of the reintegration of all things in Christ, right? That's how Paul even talks about it in 1 Corinthians 1:15 or Colossians 1:15 through 20, is that Christ is he is the image of God coming back to restore images of God, right? And what happened when the image of broke in us or was bent in us towards sin? The curses on creation, the curses on our work, the curses on our marriages, the curses on child rearing, right? The all of those things, the curse of distance from God, and all of them, which are fundamentally curses of death,
Mm.
working their way into the different aspects of our life, right? Death is the enemy. Satan is the bringer of death. The destruction of Satan and the restoration of us to life is the reason it's good news. Now, and you hear people say, like, well, you can't have good news without bad news, but then they don't even get the bad news right. Like, we've minimized the bad news down to a simple thing that you're guilty, right, and hell is coming, right? But the bad news is actually much, much bigger and broader and worse than that. We've individualized the bad news when a lot of the bad news has to do with corporate humanity and its relationship to the created order, right? You've got a created order that began dissolving because of our sin, because we're the priests of this place. We're the kings of this place. We're the priests and kings of the world. And so when our relationship with our king begins to disintegrate, our kingly rule flowing downhill disintegrates what we rule as well, right? It doesn't disintegrate our rule. Our rule continued. What we ruled was disintegrated, right? So creation moans under the weight of sin and death, right? So if we don't have a good news that says, and creation is being restored, right, by the resurrection of Christ ends up restoring us to our intended role of priests and kings, and then because of that, restoring everything that we rule and that we oblate, right, that we priest over, that we not over, we priest next to. You don't priest over, you priest across.
That's right.
But if our good news doesn't touch that, then our good news is less than the scriptural good news, right? So because we've talked about the curses, I know specifically about the curse on the thorns and thistles, right? Did we talk about that?
My memory's so horrible. I think we did a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that wasn't the only curse, right? Like Jesus's blood cleansed the sweat as well, right? His work on the cross involved him sweating blood, right? Because our work needed to be cleansed by the blood of Christ.
Yeah, we were talking about that his sweat is baptized our work. I think he talked about it like that.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So our work is restored. I mean, Jesus goes up on Golgotha, the place of the skull, and then stabs the cross into the head of the skull, right? Like there's a poetic integrated communication that's going on all throughout the scriptures to show us that God sets out from the beginning to begin undoing the curses. They're the legal curses that are put on us as the human race, as descendants of Adam. He sets out to undo those from Genesis 3:15 on, right? Genesis 3:15, he promises to crush the head of the serpent. On the cross, he sticks a cross right into the place of the skull, right? He is destroying, he's undoing the curses as he lays them down. The next thing that happens is he kills, we are supposed to die, but he begins undoing death because because animals die on our behalf so that we can have clothing, right? And then he puts the dead animal skins on us to show that they've died in our place, right? So he
Mhm.
begins the substitutionary atonement right out the gate, right? So God doesn't waste any time. But I mean, if you've ever wondered why are there so many sacrifices in Leviticus when there's only one sacrifice once and for all on the cross, well, it's because it takes that many sacrifices to show you all of the different things that the cross accomplishes, right?
Mm.
He's got to build a vocabulary of communication. He's got to build a vocabulary in order to be able to communicate what it is that he's accomplishing through his son Jesus on the cross, right? And
Wow.
so, and that took 4,000 years to build the poetic
Wow.
vocabulary of all the things that Jesus accomplished, right? So, I mean, we don't
Wow.
have we don't believe in an integrated cosmos, an integrated history. We don't believe, and so our good news, we end up being non-integrated ghosts using presuppositionalist kung fu in order to disintegrate our enemies. You know, we're not even we 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 the
So the way we get around it, if I can rephrase what you're saying, the way that we get around, we know that it should be integrated, and so in order for us to try and get around that in some way, we use apologetics the way we have in order to try and make it all fit together. Is that what you're saying in one sense or another?
we I think the way most people use apologetics is actually in to show that people live in a non-integrated universe, but we don't have an integrated gospel, an integrating
Okay.
gospel to
Yeah.
invite them back into reality with, right? So beauty as an adjective, when you say what is beauty, beauty is the interconnectedness of goodness, the
Again.
ontological interconnectedness of goodness,
Okay. Okay.
right? Something is beautiful, we because when something is good and true and it's ontologically in its proper place, then we perceive it as beautiful, right? And we want to say we add that because we don't believe in the interconnectedness of truth
Mhm.
and the interconnectedness of goodness.
Well,
Um,
or if we do, we don't have some beauties in our dictionaries of how we define it. So, like, we might have an objective standard of it, and we mark things like that's objectively beautiful. But then, if we see something else and we're naturally attracted to it, we're like, that can't be beautiful because it's not in the dictionary, right?
right, yeah.
There's another side to that too. And it's like, well, no, there's something about this is beautiful, and I don't always know what or why that is. And because I don't, we say, well, it must not be objective. It must be subjective. I think there's a lot of that. So then that's why we lean sometimes even to even a subjective standard because we're like, I know it's beautiful, but I don't have a category in what I consider to be objective beauty. Does that make sense?
It does, but I think it's because we've thinned beauty down to my feeling of attraction to it,
Even in our dictionaries.
even in our dictionaries, right? So there are um are women whose husbands love them dearly and are incredibly attracted to them that I would rather pull my eyeballs out than spend the day with,
Right.
right? And if in my mind my lack of attraction to that person means that they're ugly, objectively ugly, I don't understand how this thing works, right? Right. that you can have a a husband that will talk up and down about how wonderful and beautiful his wife is, and if I meet her and think I would never want to be married to her, that sounds terrifying. And I think therefore he is broken, right? That there's something wrong with him. Then I have subjectivized beauty, right? Now, because the way that our experience of beauty happens is our experience of beauty happens within our story and within our experience, and our experience of beauty is a tiny, teeny sliver of the reality of the beauty of the cosmos and God's experience of beauty, right? God, we we mm, we experience we
Uh-oh.
experience within time, within the order of time. It gets hard to even talk about some of this thing, but our experience of beauty is as we kind of walk the tightrope of our life story. We don't ever step off of it. We don't ever step out of it. Outside of within community, within the context of the Lord's Supper and within baptism, there are times in which we live an experience broader than our own story, but we experience for the most part just our own story and the sliver of beauty that God intends for us to experience.
Mhm.
Um, but God's intention is for all of it to be experienced and enjoyed by us as a human race corporately, right? So I don't actually have to experience all of the beauty myself because a lot of it was created for my brothers and sisters and other people to experience, and which is also good. And then our experience as a whole is brought together in community as we tell one another stories about our lives, as we get to know, as we know one another deeply. And, I can experience another man's love for his wife as he tells me about it, right? That's a real communication because we aren't billiard balls that are disconnected. We are knit together into a single unit, into a single corporate body. And so there's this there we discover our place in the world partly by seeing other people in their place and rejoicing with them.
Well, we have to I wanna we're gonna have to take beauty things we talk about because that's one of the things that everybody argues about. Subjective, objective, how do you know, objective, that whole 9. And I think the part of this comes to play in that because when you're talking about the gospel, which I wanna get back to for a second, um, when you talk about the gospel and the beauty of it, no one knows where to strike that line at of what's beautiful. So then they don't talk about the gospel in a beautiful way, right?
Right.
So you got people who on one side of this talk about like, man, your whole life will change. You got to give you everything you want, right? All of a sudden, the beauty is in self or inside of achieving all the stuff that you would ever want in your life, and God's gonna bless you, and you're gonna be this, that, and the other thing. And then there's other people who be like, the beauty of it is you ain't going to hell.
Right. Yeah. That it's all in, it's, it, I mean, it's nihilistic.
Yeah.
And,
Well,
but
yeah.
not nihilistic, meaning there is no meaning. Nihilistic, meaning all of the meaning is in what it's not, which is what nihilism originally meant. Right. And this is something that I think a lot of Christian apologists, what they've just been taught poorly, that nihilism doesn't mean there's no meaning. Nihilism means all meaning is derived from what a thing is not. Um, so which seems like a small distinction, except for when you understand that, then you can actually be a Christian nihilist without realizing it, and present the gospel in a nihilistic way without realizing it.
You think that's what we're doing right now?
I think that's what we do, right? That we rarely have a positive apologetic,
So then,
an apologetic from the beauty of Christ, an apologetic from the beauty of his story. And now, because ugly isolates us, beauty integrates us. Beauty pulls us towards, ugly pushes us away. And there's something, I mean, hell is an ugly place. This is, the Great Divorce. C.S. Lewis does this really well in the opening chapter, describing how ugly hell is, and how we can actually begin experiencing hell in advance. We can like pull the future hell into the present
Romans
in the way
1.
that we live. Yeah, exactly. And he shows how ugly it is. And so that's okay but then, all the rest of the chapters are about the beauty of heaven, right? Or the beauty of communion with Christ, the beauty of communion with God, which is heaven. Because where heaven happens is not nearly as important as who is there, right? That's actually the thing. So, because I believe that in the resurrection, the earth will be restored, heaven will be returned to a face-to-face relationship, and that there will be, every Sunday we'll go up the escalator to worship in heaven and then come back down and live our lives the rest of the days on a restored earth, right? So you've got that sort of and people get really into like, well, where is heaven going to be, but that doesn't matter. Wherever Jesus is, that's where I want to be. That's the point. The being with God is the point. Being face to face with the Lord like we are intended to be, that's actually the point. How it works, what I could care less, right? It could be we could all be on rafts just floating through the water the rest of eternity, and if I'm with Jesus, I'm happy, right?
Yeah.
Now, I don't believe that's what it's going to be. I mean, I think there's going to be all sorts of activities, and I believe that the weekly rhythms of worship are going to continue into heaven. I think that it's the only one that doesn't need the sun, the moon, and the stars to mark it out, right? So it can be eternal without the sun, the moon, and the stars. So
go ahead. I'll let you finish because there's just go ahead.
Which is why I think God gave us that. Go ahead. I'm rambling now at this point.
I'm intrigued by what that's why God gave us what.
Well, so because the sun, the moon, and the stars are they go away, right? There's the space between heaven and earth disappears in the resurrection. So there's no place for sun, moon, and stars. The physical bodies themselves, that space, that place is going to go away. I think that there are associated angelic beings with the planets that are going to stay with us, but their houses are going to be moved around and such. But the debate in the Middle Ages was not if there were angelic beings associated with the planets. It's whether or not they wore them like a body, they lived in them like a house, or they rode them like a horse, right? the planets.
Okay, see, this is why I let you go, because you be saying stuff and I'd be like, what just happened? So
but I think in the resurrection that space goes away. Heaven and earth are face to face again.
Okay, so this is what I want to get to. There's two things. I don't want to forget this. Don't forget, I want to talk about how should we be presenting the gospel in a way that,
okay.
I want to talk about that in a second. But right now you just hit on something like how they used to be. So this gets into the enchantment part of the world in the beginning. Was it like that in some point where heaven and earth, there was more of a free flow back and forth?
Well, so what you have is in the beginning says there's heaven and earth, right? And then God creates the firmament, which is a space between heaven and earth, right? So heaven and earth are pulled apart, so there's a space there, and then that's renamed heaven,
Yep.
and then the original heaven is renamed the heaven of heavens,
Yep.
right? So, um, but then at the end, heaven and earth, at the end of the book of Revelation, heaven and earth are face to face again. In 1 Corinthians 15, we see now again that heaven and earth recovered or returned to that original state. And the kind of Jacob's ladder image is a space between heaven and earth, and Jesus, or is a ladder between heaven and earth, and Jesus explicitly points at that and says, "That's me." Right? Like that ladder between heaven and earth. Well, and what's happening there? The angels are ascending and descending on it, and Jesus says, "You will ascend and descend on it." And Calvin takes that image into his theology of worship and says that in the present, that happens when the gathered church is called into worship, right? That there's a spiritual presence of us before the throne of God, that by the power of the Spirit, spiritual, capital S, by the power of the Spirit, we are brought into the presence of God in worship, right? So there's not a distance anymore between us and God when we worship the way there was in the Old Testament, right? Like we talked about how you worship, when you make sacrifices to Mars, it shows up on his table, and the whole point is he's distracted and he's kept at a distance. Well, the book of Leviticus flips that entire system inside out, and you want to be close to God, and so you make sacrifices because then you can move close to God, right? So your sacrifice ascends before the throne, and you are included in the smoke or in the ascension because by faith you have been united with this animal. You can't go in because of death, but the animal dies on your behalf, like the animals that became Adam and Eve's clothing, and then they ascend up before the Lord, and you get to be in the presence of God, right? You want to be with God so much that, but you can't. But the sacrificial system makes it so that you can. Calvin says, and now our worship is greater, which means we ascend without the need of an animal sacrifice by the power of the Spirit, because Jesus is the once for all sacrifice.
So this is like when you get in Ephesians, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, who has blessed us with every spiritual blessings and seated us at the right hand of the Father, right? And see with him at the right hand of the Father. So now that puts us back in restorative pre-fall situation,
exactly.
right?
A pre-fall situation, and in fact, even greater than what Adam and Eve had. I think they would have had it eventually, but what they had in the garden, we have something even greater, and that's why Hebrews says that those were shadows of the things to come. Our ascension in the animal was a shadow of the things to come, but are now present in our worship. Right now, wherever the church is gathered, that is the temple of the Lord, and we ascend. Well, in the resurrection, all of those things that are by faith are going to be by sight then, right? So I mean, this is why Calvin was so insistent that people hearing the sermon on Sunday morning were hearing the voice of Jesus, right? We're in the presence of God. He's speaking his word to us. This is why it's so important that a sermon as a corporate art form is accurate to the scriptures, because that corporate art form of this preached word is the way that the voice of Jesus continues to speak into the world, the recreative voice of Jesus, right? Jesus was the creative word that created the world in 6 days. He's the recreative word that recreated the world in the 3 days and 3 nights in the tomb and in the resurrection. And now he continues to be the creative speaker, right? And his word is the recreative word. And the place where that is spoken is in the corporate gathered church when we ascend before by the power of the Spirit, we ascend into the presence of God. God speaks his recreative word to us, and then it echoes out of us in the rest of the week. Right. So that's in Micah. He writes the word on our hearts, the law on our hearts, and then the law goes into the rest of the world as we descend the mountain. Right. That's Micah. So right, you've got this process of the restoration of the world, the
It's so
recreation of.
That's so post-mill. Oh
It
my
is
God.
post-mill, but it's also, but that's just because post-mill is it. I guess that's what I would say. I mean, I discovered I was post-mill like I didn't know what the word, hadn't heard the word. I loved Christmas music. Right. And so this is how I became post-mill. Guy teaching a Sunday school at my church read Joy to the World, the lyrics out loud. Right. As far as the curse will, Jesus's grace will extend as far as the curse is found.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, that's really cool. So I went up and I was like, what's with that? And he gave me a Jonathan Edwards book. The history on the history of the covenant work of God, I think is what it's called. Something like that. It was short. He didn't finish it. So the last part of it was just the outline, right? Because he died of smallpox vaccine while trying to write it. And I was like, oh man, this is great. And so I totally embraced it and I personalized it. So I thought what that meant is there is no sin in my life that God is not intent on overcoming. Right. So I was post-mill about my own sanctification and the sanctification of people. And then somebody was like, well, and actually it was the same guy. He was like, that eventually affects the world around you too. And I was like, oh, that's amazing. And then somebody later was like, you know what that's called? And I was like, just the Bible, right? And he was like, no, that's called post-millennialism. So it was Gary DeMar's book, and Last Days Madness. Somebody gave me that. And I read it and I was like, well, I already believed most of that stuff from the historic hymnody of the church and that's where a lot of the education of our children happens, is the songs we sing in church. That's where they get most of their theology for the first 15 years of their life.
So,
because they're being retuned into who they're intended to be. And so then somebody was like, well, Gary DeMar in that book was like, this is what's wrong with dispensationalism. And I was like, that's weird. I didn't know about dispensationalism. And then, but he was like, it let me into the secret club and told me what it was called.
That club is starting to grow, but I think that club misses some of the enchantment that we're talking about. So this is,
they've got time.
We're post-mill. They got time.
Post-mill jokes.
There is so, okay, I'll tell you about this. This is going to take me a minute to kind of unwrap. All right. I've been going through James with the kids. It's a good book to go through with your children. Just want to say that right away. And I got to chapter 5 and I'm just going to read a little bit of this. Chapter 5, verse 13. If anyone among you suffering, let him pray. Is someone cheerful? Let him sing psalms. Is anyone among you sick? Let him call for the elders of the church and let them pray over him, anointing him with the oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer of faith will save the sick, and the Lord will raise him up. And if he has committed sins, he will be forgiven. Confess your trespasses to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. Now, this is the part that got me. Elijah was a man. Where'd that come from? Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain. And on the land, it did not rain on the land for 3 years and 6 months. And he prayed, and again, and the heaven gave rain, and the earth produced its fruit. Um, so I started going back and thinking, wait a second. So this is first of all, this is pretty radical stuff. So if you got a person who's sick, you know, it says, okay, go to the elders, have them anoint him with oil
It
and pray.
doesn't. It says specifically that the person who's sick goes to the elders and
Yeah.
says, "Will you anoint me with oil?"
Let him call
Right.
the elders
So
of the church. Yeah.
yeah. So he doesn't. So the elders don't make
Right.
the elders don't go to him and say, "Hey, let us anoint you with oil." The
Right.
person says, "Will you anoint me with oil?" Yeah.
That part's important because just the structure of it.
It's the liturgical structure of the community.
And the prayer of faith will save the sick, and the Lord will raise him up. And if anyone commits a sin, let him be forgiven. But then the way he goes into Elijah after
Yeah.
prayer.
So here's
Yeah. Go ahead.
so um back when I was pastoring, we had a couple of healings, but one of them was in a situation like this, right, where you come in, where somebody came in and their son was having was ill, and the doctors had no solution, and so he said, "Can you anoint him with oil?" I was like, "Yeah, we'll get the elders." I'd never done an anointing. I wasn't really trained. I'd never been anointed. I'd never trained. I'd
What
never
kind of oil
seen.
did you use?
Right.
Motor
So
oil?
I went and got a little bottle of extra virgin olive oil.
That's how we used to
Um,
do it. Yeah.
yeah. Went to the oil aisle at the grocery store and just walked down and was like, "That seems right. Extra virgin olive oil. It's a little bottle."
Mm-mm.
Was
No,
it
it's
not right?
no, no, no. You got to go have the minister of God who's prayed over and put all the incense and smells inside of it, and fervently prayed over that oil before you can use that oil. You can't just go to Walmart. That ain't no
Yeah.
blessed oil. You got to have pre-blessed oil, bro.
Straight. I think it was Trader Joe's, but yeah,
Oh yeah, no, yeah, definitely
definitely not Trader Joe's. It's,
ain't got no
I
spirit
mean,
in it.
although that's some good capitalism. I like Trader Joe's, but
Different spirit.
uh, yeah, I didn't. I mean, I wasn't going to go to Whole Foods and get demonic oil or something. Anyway, and I don't know what I'm doing, right? And so I've got a towel there, and then this kid sits down. We lay hands on him. We pray. We anoint him with oil and read a psalm over him. But see, I don't know what I'm doing. And so I just dump the oil on his head. And oil, I just learned real quick, does not stay put. And so it's like all over. It's like cover this little kid with oil. And he was like, whoa. And so I'm like trying to like wipe it up. It was so funny. And I was talking to the dad about it recently. Do you remember that? And he's like, I don't know. I'd never been to anointing. It didn't seem weird to me. So I was just pouring all this oil all over him.
You gotta watch
Such a mess, right?
environment.
But he was healed, which was great. His intestines had stopped working and they started working again. It was beautiful. But it wasn't because we knew what we were doing, right? It was because it was, in my mind, it was the faith of this child and his parents, who they saw what God said to do. They said, "Oh, that's what we're supposed to do," and then the Spirit of God acting as well. And He doesn't act in every time you pray for healing, but He does sometimes. And when it's according to His plan and His purposes, and it literally was just in my garage, because I knew that the oil might get to other places, and so we didn't do it inside.
So
And it did. It got everywhere.
this,
But then I looked up later. You're supposed to like anoint, like you put it on your thumb, and all that.
put it in
but
the palm of the hand.
but I think what's interesting about the passage is the objection that he deals with, which is the objection that first came to my mind, was, I don't have any healing powers.
Right.
Lord, why are you sending them to me? When he says, look, Elijah was just a man, and he healed he healed the earth, but in a specific way. It had to do with the lifting of the curse, right, on the ground, right? The curse that came. So that there's a covenant office that ministers hold, that elders hold, a covenant office that is a curse breaking office.
Or putting could you also say, because with Elijah, the first thing he says that he prayed it wouldn't rain. So
Right.
he
Yeah. That's
actually,
what I mean. Curse
yeah,
bringing.
yeah.
Right. So thinking about that passage actually ended up changing even the way we did our corporate prayers at our church. Right. Where we added a corporate prayer for the city to our church. Right.
Mm,
We're like, oh, wait, that's what Elijah does.
right.
Right. He hits and so that way, the first time we pray for the city isn't Gay Pride March Day, right? That we are a church that has an eye on the fact that we are the priests of this city. This is our city. This is where God put us. This county, this village, wherever it is God put us, this is where our priesthood extends. And some of that is just, as a conservative, I believe in the reality of legal borders, that's a God established historical process. So I'm not a libertarian. So you think like, yeah, this is a real place. God sees this city as a corporate entity, and he has put us here as the priests. And yeah, we're just people gathered, but Elijah was just a dude, right, who held an office. Right? He was brought into the office of prophet, and all of the offices are held by the church corporately, and the officers of the church, we call them officers of the church because they are corporate officers, or they're not corporate in a corporation sense, in a covenantal
Yeah.
sense, a personal
Yeah.
covenantal sense. And that's how that God acts and enacts his grace and his kindness through the covenants, or through the real covenants. He's bound himself to act in those ways.
There's and so dealing with some of this too in this verse. Some of this stuff is not just as it's dealing individually with someone. It's telling them to be fervent in their prayer too, and ask God to heal them, and so on and so forth. But it made me think about the nature and character of man before the fall as well. So would you have this with Elijah? He's operating as a prophet, right? And he's able to, which there's so many implications to that. He's able to say to poor ruling kings and people who have authority that are not using it properly, in a city, you're cursed. And so I pray God doesn't give you any rain. There's no peace here for you until you repent, and then to remove that curse at the same time. But I was thinking, okay, so what if you think about pre-fall? What type of actual authority did Adam have that was given to him that we don't think about or consider because we're so far removed from it? But it just, you know what I mean? It's because, and this is something that we talked about a little bit before on the phone, but I was thinking, okay, wait a second. Adam loses his authority over earth. Like, and so when I think about, okay, so wait a second, the second Adam has full authority over earth, and he exercises some of that before resurrection.
Right.
Or are we just saying all that is which part of the hypostatic union is operating? Because that's what I mean?
Yeah, totally. No, it's a really good question, and I think so.
I guess let me try even while you're thinking about that. Let me try even better to say this. Was some of the things that Jesus did given to him? Was some of the things that he was operating was because he was sinless and was the right authority over that, even though he had to go claim it and rescue it? And some of that would have been the authority that Adam would have had the ability to walk in.
Right.
So that was not necessarily,
Here's first, I think you have to justify the question, and this is how I would justify the question. So we one of the accusations, I think false accusations, that was leveled at the medieval scholastics was that they would sit around arguing how many angels could dance on the head of a pin.
Mm-hmm.
And that's stuck for whatever reason. Now, that's the sort of argument a bunch of ignorant people make about the smart kids in class, right? We don't need your stupid, intelligent education. You're just sitting around arguing. In reality, that's what happened. Is the most educated people in the history of the world, the most educated culture in the history of the world, is accused of sitting around and arguing how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. We live in a culture that can't even count.
Right.
and we accuse them. They were the most bookish culture in the history of the world, but they sat around and they actually had this argument. You did warn me that we might go here, so I looked a little bit. So
they actually had this argument.
They actually had some of these questions. And one of the interesting ways that they answered it was that the offices would still exist in the way they saw things, and this was because of the particular way they understood the integrated universe, and that officers would have authority, and so kings would have Jesus. So Jesus's healing ability was part of his kingship. And so the kings of the earth, the ones that held the kingly authority, would have had some sort of healing ability, right? That his authority, he had authority over demons. He had authority over diseases, right? That those are authority questions when it comes to healing. And so, Tolkien actually brings some of this into the Return of the King when he talks about the hands. What is the proof that Aragorn is the real king? Is that the hands of a king are the hands of a healer, and he goes through and he lays hands on people and heals them, right? So this is coming from this older scholastic Anglo-Saxon meditations, the Latin and Anglo-Saxon scholastics, meditating upon the authority of Christ, and what does that mean for the way our kings are supposed to act, right? And so, but in practice, what that meant was the establishment of hospitals, right? That what government hospitals, but it was kings' hospitals, right? Because you had a king was supposed to be in the healing business, right? And so they began funding hospitals and things. So you start getting in the 1300s, you start getting merchants establishing hospitals for pay, as a capitalistic enterprise, and with good intentions, right? It wasn't they weren't bad intentioned, but one of the greatest hospitals in Italy, in Florence, to this day was established by Beatrice's father, right? Dante's first love. There's a hospital still running in Florence to this day, and he was a banker, right? He was a successful merchant turned banker. But in that earlier medieval understanding, pre-Renaissance, kings healed. That was part of their authority. They had authority, so they had authority over the physical. And how should authority be used? Well, for healing. Right. Now, our conception of the world has shifted such that we don't acknowledge kings and authorities, corporate covenantal authorities. So you had this switch in understanding that the right to rule, to the permission to rule by the people, right? That people are the real authority, that the population was the people, or the population was the authority, and they gave somebody the permission to rule them for a time, or to administrate over them, maybe would be a better way to put it. We don't even believe in rulership anymore. Like, I would love to have rulers. We don't have rulers. We have bureaucrats, right, that are put in place by the process of the people voting, and so because we don't believe in authority anymore outside of my own personal choice, because we don't believe in an integrated universe in which hierarchies makes sense because we live in a world in which hierarchy reflects God, right? That reflects the triune God who has existed in an eternal hierarchy, all of the authority which is used for the love, glorification, and exaltation of the others. We don't believe in that, and so we don't believe in a world that would reflect that. So we're functional monotheists at best, which you see in all sorts of ways because of the way we organize, right? There is power over and there is power gathered, right? And it's always a rivalry between the population and the person the population puts in charge. You've got this constant tug of war and rivalry. And sometimes one of them gets all the power and oppresses the others. Sometimes the other gets all the power and throws them out.
Which
Right.
is why critical race theory gets such a strong foothold, because that's how we operate.
Right.
So you just made me think about something when you started that. Are you saying the best way to answer this question is to look at the offices and say, what were they intended to do? If Adam was in the garden, he was a prophet, priest, and king, right? For earth. That's what he was, right? He was a priest for kind of like between God and earth. And we talked about that last time. And a prophet to communicate the truths of God back to people. He was go between relationship, right? So he was supposed to teach Eve, right? That was his.
Yeah. He's a husband, king, and priest, but yeah.
Husband, king, priest.
Yeah, the husband is the prophet role.
Yeah. Husband, king, that's actually, I don't
in
like
terms
that.
of offices. There's not the prophetic office is established in Abraham as a new thing that comes into the world.
Got you.
Yeah.
So husband, king, priest. Right, I got you. Okay.
So in Timothy, that's where Paul says the husband role is the teaching role, not prophet. So
right. So that is a mature version of a prophet, then, would you say? Mature.
I think the prophet is a husband role that is outside of marriage, right? So the prophet role, when God gives people people prophets, it's him husbanding them, and so they're the stand-in for God as husband.
That's good. That's very helpful, because you see him do that with David's line, the king line there. Okay, that's very helpful. So then you look at those roles, you can say, okay, those roles and what they're traditionally supposed to do, apart from sin entering, they actually have real control over nature in one sense, right? Would you say that?
Control over creation. Yeah.
Creation. Yeah. So they have a real authority over creation.
But I don't think over the nature of creation.
Right. That's right.
Like,
that's
creation has a nature
already.
But part of the authority is to bring it to its intended end. So it's an historical, a history bound nature that involves development, that can be developed. But it's not. But the nature itself is from the beginning.
That's super important, and the reason that's important is because if you look at the World Economic Forum, this is why I'm getting here. It's not like this is a crazy question, because if you look at what they're doing, they're actually growing ears and lungs and bones. They're growing bones. Your bone from your DNA. They're remaking all this stuff, and so we're seeing the reconstruction of man. And they're doing it there. And so it's not impossible or insane to think like, oh, there's some sort of ability. The technology is, there's a ghost in that machine for it's not like just, oh, we can just grow a bone. No, you don't just grow bones. There's something else that's going on there, right? You know what I mean? And they are operating within maybe an office that probably would have been given, or Adam had authority over at some point. So let's say somebody would break a bone or something. Is it possible that Adam would have the ability to bring forth healing to a broken bone, not ever having fell from sin? Is there, is that making sense? Because I'm looking at that, and I'm looking at James, I'm looking at them asking for the elders to come and pray and to heal. And I'm looking, well, what would have looked like? What will it look like as man become rightly restored to God? Is there authority in some sense over nature in the way that, you see it with Elijah? he's able to pray and stop the weather. He's you know what I mean? It's not and is there some and you see the Christ coming and having full authority over uh the land, man, and rightly putting things, he's beating people out of temples, right? Like he's healing the sick, and those things weren't just done um uh because he has authority. He's doing it because he's telling people who he is. So those are to testify of him, but they're testifying to him because he's actually the right Adam.
Yeah. Yeah,
You
he's
know what I
and
mean?
he is bringing the offices back together that have
Right.
been separated. And I don't think they were separated because of sin. I think God always intended to separate the offices. Um but Christ is restoring them back into himself, and then he separates them again as well, right? So you don't end up
Right.
um with bishop kings until things go wrong, right? That's um, in the late Middle Age. Yeah,
Right.
the right at the end of the Middle Ages, beginning of the Renaissance, you have an attempt to return to bring the authority of the ecclesiastical authority and the civil authority back together. Right? That's separated. That separation of separation of authority or separation of powers or institutional separation. You know, we call it the separation of church and state. I don't think it's a bad name. I do think it's misunderstood now, but that separation is a biblical understanding,
Sphere
right?
sovereignty.
Sphere
Right.
sovereignty, right? You take Christianity out and you don't get the separation of church and state anymore. And I think that's one of the things that's interesting is people complain about the, you anyway, that's a whole nother issue, but that Jesus is the new husband, the new prophet, the new priest, the new king, all of those, and every act that he does, every story that he tells is, um, is he's working out of those offices. And we don't understand the gospels. This is why we allegorize the gospels all the time, right? I mean, we live in an age of allegorization where we take everything that Jesus says and we immediately say, how do I fit into that, right? And so we allegorize it and say, oh, he told the story of the Good Samaritan, and or or David and Goliath, I think, is a good example. And we say, I should be like David, right? Well, that's an allegorical interpretation. There's nothing wrong with that. That's often how we apply difficult things, is through allegorization. But we allegorize everything, and the people that claim to be literalists are often the very worst about allegorizing everything. But it's because we don't see that the world is a living allegory, right? That we have a place in, right? So Jesus is, he is the prophet, the priest, the king, right? And so everything in creation points us back to Jesus, points us back to him, and points us. So there's this, there's a deep authority that he carries with him that is a restorative authority. If Adam had not lost it, the restoration wouldn't have been needed, but he would have carried that same deep authority. But
Mm.
instead of a restorative authority, it's a bring to its telos, bring to its fruition authority, right? It's the authority of a gardener that says, what ought this tree to be? Well, it's a peach tree. It's supposed to produce peaches. I have the authority to help this tree produce the most peaches possible. If I use it right, that gardener's authority makes flourishing.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus brings that same gardener's flourishing authority to all that he does, but he has to restore first.
Okay.
And then he says, you will do more to his apostles. You will do more than I did.
Mm.
Because then he restores us to that restorative authority. to that gardener's authority and says, now go garden the whole thing, right? And that means everything about being a human is a gardener's task with gardener's authority. Whether it's, you've got great, wonderful stories. Some of my favorite missionary stories are the ones where the missionary shows up, goes and finds the authority of the land, goes and finds the king or the chieftain, and the chieftain says, I don't trust you, but the law of hospitality means I can't purposefully kill you. I'll give you a piece of land. And they give him the haunted woods. They give the missionaries the haunted woods where people go in and never come out. And the missionaries say, perfect. And they go in and they begin cutting down the trees in the haunted woods. And everybody's like, but those trees are all demon possessed. And the Christians are like, it used to be, now we own it. And so they fled. That's how this works. Right. And so then they turn the haunted wood into a beautiful place. They build a church there. And next thing you know, the woods that everybody was afraid of that had some sort of demonic connection are now the place that everybody is converted, and they begin going there and worshiping. And the chieftain, in his mind, was getting rid of them forever, not realizing he was actually getting rid of the demonic powers that were holding his people in, that were keeping his people living in fear. He's actually getting rid of them, not even realizing it, right? That's what I mean by this is a symphony God has written, and even our attempts to sing a different melody turn out to be a harmony with God's overarching melody.
You didn't answer my question.
Of course I didn't. What was the question again? I think I did. Adam's going to have the gardener's. He's going to have the gardener's authority that can bring each thing to its intended end.
You did. Okay, so then the intent. This is really important because right now we see, and you corrected me when I said he has control over nature. I wasn't thinking about the nature of a thing. I was thinking of the outcome of nature. Like you corrected me.
Yeah, I was not really correcting you. I was just
no, you were, and it was good.
Specifying.
No, you were correct because it was being a little sloppy there, and that needed to be corrected because what the World Health Organization is doing, along with the World Economic Forum, is wanting to change the nature of it.
Yeah.
See, that's why that was very important, is because they're looking to say, oh, we can actually turn a watermelon seed into a peach.
Right.
Like that's, and so they're realizing the authority they have, and they're trying to recreate it as if they are God. And that's what was it like, but you don't get to change the seed. You get to cultivate it.
You get to cultivate it.
Right. So,
but I think because God gave many of things in the world, developable natures, right? Natures that have potential within them, right, to be developed. Yeah. We get the illusion we fall under the bad enchantment, or under the spell that we think that we are like God. He created from nothing, and we think we have that power over the nature of a thing, but actually God just made developable natures, historical natures that within history can be brought to an intended end, because his nature outside of time can't be captured in a snapshot, can't be reflected in a snapshot. He needs a historical mirror to be able to reflect himself into the world, right? To be able to poetically display himself. It's not enough to just give a snapshot. He has to give living things that move and develop, and because his nature is so extensive, significant, deep, beautiful, broad, wide, that the beauty of him in his non-developing nature can only be displayed in a developing nature that is historical. Does that make sense? Am I making sense?
Yeah, it's just going to take, like you said earlier, it took him 4,000 years to
develop the vocabulary
to understand
the cross.
Just to get that part of that vocabulary. And look, it's going to take eternity for us to be able to, which is, okay, that's a whole nother, my head just hurt a little bit. but I want to get to okay, man. I just feel like I'm just vomiting everything up right now. That's totally fine. This is all for me anyway. I
That's
don't
what
care.
I feel like all the time.
Yeah. So, um, this nature that Adam had now has been restored even greater because of Christ. Um, how do you communicate? Man, I'm not done with this. The uh, the authority that Adam has, his ability to be able to operate had he not sinned, because I'm questioning now. Because this is um, what Christ has done and what He's restored and given the authority back to man. There's something here. I hate using this kind of language, but um, man looking to try and flow outside of the way the cosmos works is him not living up to his true potential in one sense. I hate using that kind of language, but I don't even know any other better way to describe that, where it's like, man, if you are a gardener, you are gifted with the ability to cultivate and to bring something into its true nature, into its true fruitfulness of its nature, right? And to grow that thing. If you're not, if that's what your skill set is and you're not doing that, then you're not walking in your potential ultimately, right? Like that's what you're gifted to do, you know? So I guess like what is it that when Christ restored man, what is he restored man? What is the enchantment of that man has to bring to the world that has some of that magic to it? You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean,
Because
so
it doesn't seem like it seems like we when we talk about this, we don't talk about that side of it. Um, I mean, never mind the fact that they make humans. That's kind of amazing. Uh, but there's even the cultivation side of it. The you look at science and what science is doing right now. I hate saying science, but you look what man is doing through what God has put on earth and are able to, you know, I think that we have a lot more healing that just hasn't made it public yet of the things that we can do for the human body. Um,
yes,
I think there's a lot. I mean, just watching them 3D print a ear
an
it
ear.
blew,
Yeah, that
blew my mind.
that
And
was nuts.
listening to David Bonson talking about eye transplant, an eye transplant. I didn't even know we could do that, and how they put the new retina. And I'm just like, this is insane. This is magic.
It is. I
This
mean,
is, you know,
it's but it's magic in the right sense,
in
right?
the
It's
right, yeah,
restorative because you're not gaining power over. You don't have any. There's no one saying or gaining the power over the nature of things yet,
right,
right? They're
right,
saying, look, I can. Somebody loses their eye, I can fix that now,
right.
right? I but it's because of how eyes work and the knowledge um, that we have gained through this, and this is something that people don't I don't think are we're not grateful enough for, but the years of peace, the years without war, without rivalry, that have
Mm,
made this sort of thing possible. I mean, there was a lot of advances, scientific advances there were before in the world. It wasn't until Christendom that the scientific advances spread broadly because there wasn't a rivalry. The rivalry was broken down, and so you could have the the monasteries in France developing new water wheel technology and immediately copying it down, and sending it to every monastery. Hey guys, check this cool thing out that we have discovered. Right, the steel tipped plow that spread monastery to monastery to monastery until it was everywhere, and that um, was the largest change in food production
mm,
until you had mechanization, right? Was the steel tip plow, and that the scientific advances are made possible by peace. Christendom brought peace, right? And if the peace continues, the scientific advances will. In wartime, you all of the scientific all of the scientific effort goes into defeating your enemies. right?
And
So
to defeat enemies, yeah.
yeah, and that's a waste. I mean, it can be used for good in the long run, but it's a waste of that
What
energy.
okay. So what happens though when you have demonic possession? All that scientific energy goes into what?
It goes into the the worship of false gods, right? Into idolatry, and this is uh if because you have people that say, oh man, if I can get that retina, what if we start putting in like robot eyes? And what if the it's called, I think, and it's becoming really popular. It's a There's a whole movement, transhumanism, right?
Yeah.
Right, where you start saying, can I replace my body parts with superior robot versions of body parts? What's a waste of time? What it
Yeah.
That's a waste
Brain
of energy, right?
that's
We've got people dying of cancer, and you're like, what if I gave myself a robot eye? Right? So, but the whole transhumanist movement is taking that. I mean, I think the whole global homogenization transhumanist movement is an attempt um, to redirect the scientific energy away from the current use, which is still has the habits of its use in the worship of God, right? For the benefit of your neighbor, into the power struggle, right? Into the it's redirecting it to an idol, right? That because you're saying it used to be in the service of life was good enough, but now it has to be in the service of this idol, which is promising that I won't die. But there was never any illusion that in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, even in the Enlightenment, that, well, in the Enlightenment is where you get the roots actually of the transhumanist movement. But there wasn't an illusion that we were going to overcome death with medicine, right? We were going to serve people in their life, bless their life,
mm,
extend their life, make their life better. But we weren't going to overcome death, right? That's a theological. That's something that is done in the cross and in the resurrection eventually. Um, but the transhumanist movement, you begin getting discussions in the Enlightenment of what if we could actually defeat death with science, right? What if we could defeat, if we could live forever with science? Or, and now people are saying it might be possible because they're looking at the advances, the technological advances. It's not possible, right? The last enemy that will be destroyed is death, and it
yeah.
will be destroyed when Jesus comes back, right? And
That
so that's a waste of energy, and it's energy poured before an idol to say that at all, or to consider it. Um, so I don't know. Did I even answer your question?
no, that's good. I'm throwing a lot on the table because there's a bunch here. Here's where I want to really focus on before we go real quick. I want to deal with how do we break the curse, and then breaking the curse. When we talked about this, how should we be proclaiming the gospel so that we get people to see the beauty of the world that God has designed in Christ and integrate them into a world where they're like, oh, this is how this world is enchanted and it's beautiful and I love it. How do we do that? So first breaking the curse and then re-enchanting the world.
the so the curse breaking is all done, but the is all accomplished in the cross, right? And so by faith, we bring that curse breaking into the spheres of our life, especially any spheres that we have authority over, right? So if you're a kid, the sphere that you have authority over within your family is the way you treat your parents, which is
Mm,
why Ephesians 6, um, it says it will go well with you in the world, right? It is a curse breaking activity when their kids honor their parents. right?
Mm.
That's the language that is being used by Paul, that he's picking up from the Ten Commandments, and he's dropping it on these heathen kids, saying,
Is
you
that
got an
baptized
opportunity to
kids
break the curse.
or unbaptized kids? Does it work for both, or baptized kids or unbaptized kids? I mean, it says kids. Is it dealing
You're
with one
always
or the other?
you're
I just
always wanting me to
I just want to know if whose kids. Like, does it work for everybody's kids, or there's a certain type of kids that this are supposed to be obedient to parents? Baptized kids supposed to be obedient, or unbaptized kids supposed to be obedient to parents? Trying to figure
yeah,
out what. It's because I just want to know where the curse is broken at, whose house is
right.
going.
I mean, one of my favorite things to do is talk people into baptizing their kids. But this is why, right? Is that because baptizing your kids is a way of saying, uh, the Jesus died for us. The curse stopped. The curse doesn't isn't effective here, right? I love when when in my church people come forward in lines and they get the bread and the wine, and we pray with people as they come forward. It's different than any church I've ever been to. You have always been in churches where the bread and wine is passed out, and I think you've got the freedom to do either. And not John Knox, when he changed the practice within the Presbyterian Church, or presented a new practice within the Presbyterian Church of the bread and wine being brought to the people, he was right in the theological implications of the poetic activities within the liturgy. But I still think we actually have the freedom to do it either way. And we, in our church, people walk down and they take the bread and the wine. And one of my favorite things is giving the bread and the wine to pregnant women, right? And because first I address them, Christ's body broken for you, and then I address their womb, and Christ's body broken for you, and get to pass the bread, and then Christ's blood shed for you, Christ's blood shed for you, right? It's just that it's one of my favorite things, because I do believe that the curse on child rearing is being rolled back. It's broken and is being rolled back. And the rivalry between parents and children is part of the curse that's broken, as well as the rivalry between brother and brother that you see in Cain and Abel. That all of that is broken, and so kids in their authority as office holders as subject holders within the covenant, right? They have this opportunity to say, the curse is here. The curse stops at the door by honoring their parents. So there's curse breaking language in Ephesians 6:3. It will go well with you in the world,
Mm,
right?
mm.
It's
In the
beautiful.
world, yeah.
In the world, right? So instead of the land, so in the 10 Commandments, the fifth commandment is it will go well with you in the land. Paul says, well, that law was nailed to the cross with Jesus, went into the grave, and when it came out, it applies now to these heathen children because they've been baptized into the covenant, right? They've passed through the Red Sea, and so now the 10 Commandments apply to them. But the whole world has passed through the Red Sea, and so now the 10 Commandments, because Jesus is the new Moses, and baptism is the new Red Sea. And so now, because they receive the 10 Commandments on the other side of the Red Sea, Paul says, kids, in baptism we've passed through the Red Sea, and so now the 10 Commandments apply to us in the world now. Now we're in the situation that Joshua was in, where he was taking his sword out and conquering the world, and we're taking the word of God out, which is sharper than any two-edged sword, to conquer the world. Which is that's what that passage in Hebrews 4 is talking about. He's talking about Joshua in the land, and a greater rest that's now being brought. And then he says, because the word of God is sharper than any two-edged sword, right? So Joshua's sword that conquered the land is nowhere near as sharp as the word of God that's in the hand of the church to conquer the world. But even in, the Bible that I read right now, it breaks that section off and reapplies it allegorically with a title right over the section that says, the word of God reveals your heart, right? So it's allegorizing that passage and taking it out of context right there in my Bible with a little header, separating it from the verse right beforehand when it talks about Joshua. So it's a whole, so the other way that we break the curse in the world is by preaching Jesus. Right? We preach the death and resurrection of Jesus, and that word of God is sharper than any two-edged sword, dividing even soul and spirit. And it's going out into the world, separating the people out from the curse, right? Cutting the curse out of the world. Did I lose you?
No, no.
So,
I'm
and
looking at
then,
the time, and I know
yeah.
we're gonna go, but I'm just
And then, the fruit of the spirit, the fruitlessness is the curse.
well.
So
That's
the
the
fruit of the spirit is the other way. My first book was In Pursuit of Kindness, and I was reading the Proverbs, and Solomon says, he who pursues kindness pursues life. And I was like, I never even thought of kindness as really a virtue, right? Like, I'm
Mhm.
reformed, right?
Right,
We
right.
we're not nice to each other, right? Nice is and there's a distinction between kindness and niceness. I think that you can make, and but but um but death is the curse. What does it look like to move against that curse? It says kindness, right? So I ended up in my studies actually writing an entire book on the pursuit of kindness. What is kindness biblically? Because kindness is actually defined by Solomon as one of the ways that you roll back the curse of death in the world around you, right?
Mm.
So we everything about our lives, we have curse breaking opportunities everywhere, all of the time, right?
The curse breaking opportunities.
Yeah, because right before the fruit of the spirit is where he says, if you bite and devour, be careful lest you be consumed by one another, right? You can either eat one another, he says, or you can produce the fruit of the spirit and feed one another, right? So
Mm.
all of it is the whole section is about opposing the curses or rolling back the the curses. The church, that's what the church does. The overarching metaphor of First Timothy is the church is the restored Garden of Eden.
Mm.
So
Um,
it's
what's
hard. It's everywhere, and so it's hard to talk about it anywhere because it is the uh, it is the central um, image system, metaphor system that God speaks in.
what's the title of your book again? The Pursuit of Happiness,
Uh,
Pursuit of Kind.
in pursuit of kindness. Yeah,
Amazon.
yeah, yeah. You get it on
Okay.
Amazon.
I'm going through it right now and again, and it's like I've read it once, I glanced over it, and it's funny because there's things that you say, and when we're talking, I'm like, oh yeah, I know this, I understand this, and then after we've talked for a while, the categories, we didn't even get into the point of where Gnosticism plays in this and how we, um, the way that uh, we're comfortable seeing the world unenchanted because of Gnosticism. We didn't even get to
Yeah,
that.
right.
I want to talk about that. I got like a whole sheet of paper I didn't even get a chance to ask about. All right, this is gonna have to wait for another conversation for us. I feel like we just got started and we didn't even get to the good part, Jason, because I want to finish
Story of
going
my
through.
life.
Yeah, but so when you have curses and curses that continue to cultivate themselves has a trajectory to demon possession, right? So
Well, the curses begin because Adam hands his authority off to the devil
right,
and says, "Hey, you hold it, right?
right,
You take care of it." Now, God doesn't. Um, God is not satisfied with that, and so the history of God's people is God pushing his people back into the garden over and over and over, right? He Even Genesis ends with them in Goshen, which
that's
is
right,
like the Garden of Eden, right? So
right.
God is like, get back in there, get back in there. And we run for it, and our little short legs are too short to outrun God. So he's like, get back in there. And but the authority that handing the authority to the devil turns out to have been a bad thing because the devil is happy to abuse it, right? And so demon possession and the demonic run cultures are the devil abusing his subjects, which
But
is what he
because
does. I mean, it shouldn't be a surprise, right? And I think each attempt that he has made since since Jesus's resurrection to reestablish an empire has been thwarted within a generation. I mean, that is obvious. I think the Russian um, rule almost is the only one that almost the USSR is the only one that's almost surpassed a generation, and we'll see China's being undermined by the church's growth right now.
that and the Sansdemic, they're going um because here, well, maybe we'll talk about this tomorrow or next time. But I want to get into a little more breaking curses, how to cast out the demon in a culture.
Yeah.
Because I think that there's um so much to that. There is a way in which Christians, you had a religious group of people who had demon possession among them when Christ was there, and they didn't know how to deal with it. And then even those who were following Christ, when they tried to cast out demons, they got beat up by some of them, right?
Yeah, it didn't always go the way.
Right.
Yeah.
And so those only came out by prayer and fasting. Christ said, right. And so there's something to that. And I want to talk through some of how to, when you have a demon possessed culture, what is you got to break the curse, got to re-enchant, you got to cast out the demon. What is this process go through?
Yeah.
What does it look like in
this
a
this
world
is where I think
integrated
the
like
early
ours? You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think this is where the early missionaries have a lot to teach us. You know, that the 5th through 8th century missions, that's what they did, as they went into demon possessed cultures and converted them. And yeah, that might be fun. We can do some story time.
Well, if you had
Philip Schaff is really good on this stuff.
If you had to mark one thing to prove that America has a demon in its culture, what would you say that right there? Like if you had to mark it off and you're like, oh yeah, that's a demon.
Planned Parenthood.
I would have thought that was a pagan god sacrificing station, but yeah, okay.
We're doing child sacrifices. I was speaker at a pro-life event once. I was, and I got to go first, the biggest guy. And there were 2 of us speaking, little tiny, this wonderful guy, Roman Catholic priest. He was one of those like tough as nails Roman Catholic priests, but little guy, soft spoken, but just like he was the guy that he would stand, and I watched him do it. He stood in front of a crowd snarling and spitting at him, and preached you meet those guys. And I went first and was up telling the story of St. Brendan. The St. Brendan was an Irish missionary, and he heard that there were people on the other side of the Atlantic. And so he got in his little coracle and went to and just sailed that way, trying to find people. When at one point, some monks went with him, because when you hear there's people, what those people are up for grabs, because Jesus died and rose from the dead. Like, oh, there's people over there. I know what to do with people. We go evangelize them. Well, he's sailing, and these sea monsters start circling his boat on a Sunday morning, right? So they're going through the church service liturgy, and all of the monks that are responding, he's up front doing the first part, and they're supposed to have their responses, and they're getting quieter and quieter because the sea monsters are getting closer, and they're like, "Can you say your part quieter, Brendan?" And he rebukes them for their fear, and he starts shouting his part of the liturgy, and the sea monsters are circling, and he's getting louder and louder, and then it reinvigorates the monks, and they start saying their part louder. It's a wonderful story, but I was using it as an example of, a lot of the church, they look at the culture and they see the sea monsters circling, and they want to get quieter and quieter about abortion. And but what we need to do is actually get louder and louder, right? That we need to be more and more insistent, that and less afraid of the monsters of our culture. Well, obviously there hecklers show up, right? That's because it's an outdoor event, and it's basically a street sermon, and pretty soon they're circling me as I preach, right? And they're starting to growl, right? Because there's something demonic going on, and so I'm laughing at this point, because I'm like, and I just turn to them. I was like, you guys are making it so easy. Like, now everybody gets my metaphor because you're enacting it right in front of them, right? And but I've got a big loud voice, and so I could just raise my voice and preach over the top of them, and and I say amen, and they all walk away as soon as I stop preaching, and they all go sit under a tree in the shade. And the next guy that gets up to preach is the little Roman Catholic priest, who doesn't have the kind of voice I have, right? God gave me lungs. And so he and they start to get up, and they're coming back over, and I'm like, oh man, he's not going to be able to preach over them. And so I went over and engaged him. I was like, hey guys, what are you all doing? You really have nothing better to do? And the guy was like, no, it's kind of a boring day. It's like, so you came over to heckle? He's like, I was like, yeah, I guess so. And so I started talking to him. Well, and afterwards, a police officer came over. So I talked to him. I ended up talking to him for like an hour and sharing the gospel with him. But also, I was like, why is it that what do you guys think you're here opposing? And one of them was like, fascism. And I was like, okay, can anybody give me a definition of fascism? And one of them was like, when people tell you what to do and you don't want to do it. And they're like, nope, not even close. And I was like, anyone actually know what fascism is? And one of them guys was like, I think it's maybe economics. I was like, it is. And so I was like explaining fascist economic theory to them. And one guy goes like, so like George Bush? I was like, exactly. Like George Bush. George Bush was a fascist. He's like, really? I was like, yeah. And so was Bill Clinton. And so was Obama. Like, fascism is our norm right now. And they were like, really? And so we ended up having this long conversation. And then, I started getting their life stories, and, how they landed in this particular spot. And pretty soon, the pro-life march has moved on, and I'm sitting there talking with these guys. And then I gave them all my phone number, told them where church was, invited them. And then, they left, and the police officer came over, and he was like, thank you so much. I was so worried that was going to go wrong. And I was like, they don't even know that they're being used. And he's like, yeah, I know. So that's just kids these days, right? And so there's this journalist sitting there hearing us talk. And so she comes over and she's like, I got some questions. And so we started talking about abortion. And she was like, so what is it that you guys are opposing? Like, what's the big deal? And I just said, from the beginning, the church has been opposed to human sacrifice. So this is not a political issue for us. This is an issue of violence being done to people in the image of God whom we love. And it's an issue of a religion that is calling for human sacrifice. And I watched her write it down, right? And then and she said, can I publish this? I was like, absolutely. You can put my name to it, anything you want. What actually came out in the paper, it was my name, but the quote was, for us, this is a political issue. Right? The opposite of what I said. I watched her write it down, and she left saying, she's saying, I have not heard any of this before. This is really intriguing, and I think people are really going to be interested to hear what you have to say. Whoever her editor was like, nope. Right. And the quote that came out made it sound like I was a Republican operative. Right. Um, so I think that's demonic. Right. That there was that there is a centrally demonic activity, or that human sacrifice is the thing that demons want at their core. That's what they're always working up to. And that's what you have going on at Planned Parenthood and just abortion in general.
And it's possess the fourth estate.
Absolutely, yeah. That the fourth estate has become the mouthpiece of it all.
All right, we'll have to stop there. We're going to talk about some about that. I just got just all I got is questions. Jason. So, okay, we'll talk next time. Man, this is all I have right now is just